There are moments inside royal palaces that the world never gets to see. Moments where the carefully ironed smiles drop, where the diplomatic silence breaks, and where the tension behind closed doors becomes impossible to ignore. Most people look at the British royal family and see pageantry. They see crowns and carriages, waving hands and polished speeches. But behind all of that, there is a family. And like every family on earth, this one has its own fault lines, its own loyalties, and its own quiet battles over who matters and who doesn't. What happened in the weeks following King Charles's stunning announcement about Lady Louise Windsor was one of those battles, and it was one that very few people expected. Because nobody was watching Lady Louise. That was almost the whole point. While the world obsessed over Harry and Meghan's every move across the Atlantic, while commentators dissected every photograph of William and Kate, while Camilla carefully built her image as a dignified queen, this quiet young woman from Windsor was doing something nobody quite noticed. She was making herself indispensable. Lady Louise Alice Elizabeth Mary Mountbatten Windsor was born prematurely on the 8th of November 2003 at Frimley Park Hospital in Surrey. She came into the world early, quietly, without the grand fanfare that usually surrounds royal births. And in many ways, that set the tone for everything that followed. Where her cousins commanded headlines, Louise moved in the background. Where others sought the spotlight, she kept her head down. She was known in royal circles as a somewhat lonely figure, because all of her cousins, Peter Phillips, Zara Tyndall, Harry, William, Beatrice, and Eugenie, were significantly older than her, leaving her in a peculiar in-between space within the family. Wikipedia Geo News. Her parents, Prince Edward and Sophie, had made a deliberate choice long before Louise was even old enough to understand it. They did not want their children to grow up inside the full weight of royal expectation. As the grandchild of a monarch, Lady Louise was entitled to use a princess title, but it was thought to be very unlikely that this would change in the near future. Sophie and Edward made the conscious decision to let their children grow up without the pressure of that title, without the circus that came with it, and without the permanent spotlight that turned so many young royals into tabloid fodder before they were even adults. Woman and home. For years, it seemed like that was the end of the story. Louise would be a peripheral figure, nice girl, royal blood, but not someone who would ever change the conversation. She would go to school, perhaps go to university, perhaps get a job and fade pleasantly into the background the way minor royals tend to do when the institution has no particular need for them. The palace had bigger things to think about. Charles had only recently become king. William was preparing for his own future reign. Camilla was working hard to cement her position as a credible and beloved queen consort. There were simply too many moving pieces and too many dramatic storylines for anyone to pay much attention to Edward and Sophie's quiet daughter from Windsor. But then something shifted. Lady Louise enrolled at St. Andrews University in 2022, the same university where Prince William and Kate Middleton had met and fallen in love years before. It wasn't a coincidence that felt like a coincidence. It felt like something else, something that people would only understand in retrospect. Because while she was there, studying English literature, attending officers' training corps sessions, performing in student theater productions, and driving carriages in competition, she was also developing something rare inside the Windsor family. She was developing a reputation, not for drama, not for scandal, not for embarrassing the institution, but for being absolutely, reliably, impressively good at whatever she turned her hand to. AOL. She reportedly became a member of the St. Andrews University Officers Training Corps, and if she chose to join the military after graduation, she would become the first royal woman since Queen Elizabeth herself to serve in the armed forces. That quiet detail alone said more about Louise than 1,000 press releases ever could. She wasn't just floating through university on the strength of her surname. She was building herself. She was preparing for something, even if she hadn't yet named what that something was. AOL. Back at Windsor, the conversations were changing. Slowly at first, then with increasing urgency. The royal family had a problem. With King Charles, Queen Camilla, Princess Anne, the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh, and the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester all growing older, concerns had been quietly raised about the shrinking number of working royals available to carry out engagements. The institution needed bodies. It needed trustworthy, reliable, capable people who could represent the crown without causing headaches. And the pool of available candidates was getting smaller every year. Harry and Meghan had left. Andrew had been sidelined. Beatrice and Eugenie were living largely private lives. The York cousins had become more liability than asset. Royal Central. The king knew this, William knew this, and slowly the name that kept coming up in those conversations was one that surprised almost everyone. Louise. Quiet, sensible, disciplined, discreet Lady Louise Windsor. The girl nobody had been watching had somehow become exactly the person the institution needed most. Royal commentator Richard Fitzwilliams noted that Lady Louise had enormous potential, pointing to her long-standing interest in military affairs, her commitment to charitable work, and her passion for carriage driving, a hobby she had inherited from her late grandfather, the Duke of Edinburgh. That last point mattered more than it might seem. Philip had been one of the most beloved and respected figures in the history of the modern monarchy. The fact that Louise had taken up his passion, had competed seriously in the sport he loved, had done it not as a PR exercise, but because she genuinely loved it, that told people something. It told them that this young woman understood continuity. She understood what the crown meant, not just as a title, but as a living tradition that needed to be carried forward with care. Royal Central. And then came the Royal Windsor Horse Show. It was the moment that changed everything, or at least the moment that made everything visible to people who hadn't been paying attention. A report in the Daily Mail noted that Lady Louise had been praised for her recent role as the event organizer at the Royal Windsor Horse Show, with officials dubbing her a real asset and praising her for being hardworking. She wasn't just attending as a guest. She wasn't just waving from the stands and looking pleasant in front of cameras. She was in a high-vis vest, directing logistics, coordinating people, making decisions. The report noted that Lady Louise occupied a position which her older cousins, especially Harry, Beatrice, and Eugenie, could only dream of. She was increasingly seen as one of the more dependable younger royals, having avoided all drama and controversies. Geo News, Geo News. That phrase, one of the more dependable younger royals, landed differently inside the palace than it did in the press. Because inside the palace, dependable was the rarest and most valuable currency there was. After years of watching younger royals implode in spectacular and expensive ways, after Harry's bombshell interviews and Andrew's catastrophic fall from grace, the word dependable had taken on a new kind of weight. It wasn't glamorous, but it was powerful. PR expert Riley Gardner observed that consistency builds trust over time, and noted that Prince William had always seemed focused on protecting the monarchy's reputation and keeping the institution stable, meaning people who were discreet, measured, and media-safe were likely to become especially valuable to him. Louise was all three of those things. She had gone through her entire young life without a single damaging headline. Not one. In a family that had been through everything from secret marriages to explosive memoirs to international scandals, that kind of clean record was almost miraculous. Internewscast Journal. And there was another dimension to all of this, a dimension that made the story even more complicated, even more human. The Princess of Wales was known for her close bond with the Duchess of Edinburgh, but this closeness also extended to Sophie's daughter, Lady Louise Windsor. Kate and Louise had a relationship that went back years. When Louise was just 7 years old, she had been given a starring role as one of William and Kate's bridesmaids at their royal wedding. That connection had never faded. If anything, it had grown stronger as Louise had grown older. They attended events together. They shared interests. They moved in the same emotional orbit within a family that was otherwise often divided by geography, by resentment, and by the accumulated weight of too many old arguments. Hello, hello. Sources told Heat World that Kate and William absolutely saw Louise as someone they would like around them in a much bigger role once they took the throne. This was significant. This wasn't just fondness. This was strategy. William was already thinking about the shape of the monarchy he would eventually lead, and Louise figured prominently in those plans. She was trusted, she was capable, she was family, and she was clean. In the complicated mathematics of modern royal politics, that combination was almost impossibly rare. Celebrity gossip. So when King Charles made his announcement, when he signaled that Lady Louise's position within the royal family was changing, that she was being elevated, that she was being given a more formal and significant role, it should have been a moment of uncomplicated celebration. A young woman who had earned it, a family that needed her, an institution that would benefit from her steady, sensible presence. But it wasn't uncomplicated, because it couldn't be, not with Camilla watching, not with everything that Camilla had spent years quietly building about her own place within this family. And not with the growing suspicion inside the palace walls that the rise of Lady Louise, quiet, careful, beloved Lady Louise, was happening not just because Charles wanted it, but because William and Kate wanted it. And what William and Kate wanted had a way of making Camilla feel very, very uneasy indeed. The announcement that Charles made was not impulsive. It was not made without thought. It was the product of months of careful consideration, of conversations held in private rooms, of assessments made about where the institution was heading and who it needed to get there. In early July 2026, the royal family released official photos to honor Lady Louise Windsor, who had completed her university education at St. Andrews. King Charles and his team wrote, "Congratulations to Lady Louise on her graduation from St. Andrews University. Lady Louise was joined by her parents, the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh, as they celebrated the end of her degree." Gia News. The graduation itself was a milestone, but the way Charles marked it publicly warmly with his personal involvement was the signal. This was not a king simply acknowledging his niece's academic achievement. This was a king making a statement. Louise was being brought into the fold. Louise was being prepared for something larger, and the timing of it, coming just as the questions about the monarchy's working capacity were reaching a peak, was not accidental at all. The question that immediately followed was one that nobody was quite willing to ask out loud, but that everyone in the palace's inner circle was already thinking. If Louise was coming in, what did that mean for everyone else? What did it mean for the careful hierarchy that Camilla had spent years building around herself? What did it mean for the lines of influence that ran from the king's closest advisors through to the woman who sat beside him every morning at breakfast? The answer to those questions would not come quietly. It never did in the House of Windsor. The British royal family is very good at hiding things in plain sight. It does it all the time. A cold shoulder disguised as a thoughtful pause. A calculated exclusion dressed up as a busy schedule. A very deliberate snub wrapped carefully inside the language of protocol. From the outside, everything looks controlled, measured, deeply professional. From the inside, particularly from the inside of those long, gilded corridors where the real conversations happen, it looks like something else entirely. When word started moving through palace circles that King Charles was elevating Lady Louise Windsor into a more significant position within the firm, the reaction from those around Camilla was swift, and it was not subtle. Not because anyone picked up a telephone and said something incendiary. Not because angry emails were sent or meetings were stormed out of. It happened the way things always happen at the palace. Through silences. Through the way certain conversations were carefully steered. Through the way Camilla's inner circle began to treat the news about Louise with the particular, icy politeness that the British establishment reserves for things it finds deeply threatening. Camilla had not arrived at her position easily. Nobody who knew her story could argue otherwise. She had spent decades as one of the most vilified women in Britain. She had been blamed, fairly or not, for the collapse of Charles and Diana's marriage. She had been photographed and analyzed and criticized in ways that would have destroyed most people. She had weathered it all, the public hostility, the tabloid cruelty, the years of being called the wrong person in the wrong place at the wrong time, with a dignity that had slowly, painfully won people over. By the time Charles became king, Camilla had done something that once seemed genuinely impossible. She had made people like her. Princess Diana's astrologer, Debbie Frank, had predicted that 2026 would mark a turning point in the dynamics between King Charles, his country, and Queen Camilla, saying that the dynamics of her relationship with Charles as king and husband and the requirements of being queen were being rewritten. But the rewriting that was actually happening inside the palace was not quite the one Camilla had been expecting. It wasn't about her stepping gracefully into a new, quieter chapter. It was about the growing sense that the family was reorganizing itself around a new set of priorities, and those priorities had Lady Louise's name written all over them. AOL. What made this particularly difficult for Camilla was not simply the fact of Louise's rise. It was the source of it. It was the clear, unmistakable fingerprints of William and Kate on everything that was unfolding. Because Camilla's relationship with William had always been complicated. It was better than it had once been. Time and circumstance had smoothed many of the old rough edges, but it was never warm in the way that relationships between a stepmother and a stepson are supposed to be warm. There was always a diplomatic quality to it, a carefully managed cordiality, and when William moved, when William made decisions about the shape of things to come, Camilla felt it. She felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. A source close to the situation told Examiner that Queen Camilla became territorial when Prince William and Princess Kate appeared to expand their influence, and that Lady Louise's growing proximity to the Wales family added to those concerns. According to the account, Camilla viewed the relationship between William, Kate, and Louise as evidence that the Prince and Princess of Wales were sketching a separate blueprint without considering her or King Charles. Yahoo! That word, blueprint, was the one that mattered, because it wasn't just about Louise. Louise was almost beside the point, in a sense. Louise was the visible part of a much larger question that Camilla was asking herself in private, in the small hours of the morning, in the quiet moments between the public engagements and the official portraits. The question was this: what kind of monarchy was Charles building, and did she have a central place in it? Or was she, despite everything she had done, despite the decades of endurance and the hard-won public approval, about to find herself being gradually, politely, inexorably moved to the edges? The irony of her position was not lost on those who knew her well. Camilla had spent years fighting for her place inside this family. She had done everything right by the institution's own standards, by the standards of the people who write the rules about what royals are supposed to do and be. She had kept her head down. She had avoided controversy. She had been a steady, supporting presence for Charles through the hardest years of his life. She had shown up every single time with the kind of quiet consistency that the crown demands from its most senior members. And now, watching from the inside, she was seeing that same quiet consistency celebrated and rewarded in someone else. In a 22-year-old who hadn't even finished university 6 months ago. The thing that twisted the knife most was the particular nature of Louise's relationship with Kate. There were intriguing signs that Lady Louise had developed a genuinely close bond with Kate, who was known to keep her distance from the York sisters, Beatrice and Eugenie. Louise had even been seen wearing a royal hand-me-down from the Princess of Wales herself, a jumper that Kate had worn for a previous public appearance. These were small details in isolation, but Camilla understood symbolism better than almost anyone alive. She had spent too long inside this institution not to understand that small details were never just small details. When Kate wore something and Louise wore the same thing, that was a statement. When Kate championed Louise's name in private conversations with the king, that was more than fondness. That was politics. Internewscast Journal. According to insiders, Kate and William absolutely saw Louise as someone they would like around them in a much bigger role once they took the throne, and their interest in preparing Lady Louise for greater responsibilities had allegedly unsettled Queen Camilla. The word allegedly was doing a lot of work in that sentence, because from where Camilla sat, there was nothing alleged about it. It was happening. She could see it happening. She could feel the shape of it in the way conversations changed when she entered certain rooms, in the way certain names came up and others didn't, in the gradual, barely perceptible shift in the gravitational pull of the family's internal attention. Celebrity gossip. There was also the matter of what Louise's rise meant for Camilla's own children. Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes were not working royals. They had never been part of the institution in any formal sense. They were private citizens who happened to have a mother who was queen. That was fine. That was the arrangement. But it created a particular sensitivity in Camilla about the idea of other people's children being elevated, of nieces and nephews and cousins being drawn into the inner circle, because every person who came in with a special role and a special purpose was a reminder of what her own family did not have and would never have. Meanwhile, Louise herself was almost entirely oblivious to the political storm building around her. That was, in many ways, the most remarkable thing about her. She was not playing a game, she was not maneuvering. She had not sat in a room and calculated how to make herself indispensable. She had simply done what she always did. She worked hard, she stayed out of trouble, she showed up. At the Royal Windsor Horse Show in 2026, Lady Louise Windsor took her part-time job seriously and was seen directing her parents at the event, managing logistics, wearing a high-vis vest and getting her hands genuinely dirty in the operational work of putting on a major royal occasion. She wasn't photographed being glamorous. She wasn't performing for the cameras. She was doing actual work, the unglamorous, behind-the-scenes, sleeves-rolled-up kind of work that most people with her connections would never dream of subjecting themselves to. Hello. The Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh's daughter had been described by officials as a real asset to her team, without any airs and graces. Those 3 words, no airs and graces, were the ones people kept coming back to, because they were the opposite of what people expected from someone in her position. And they were the opposite of what the institution had become accustomed to dealing with when it came to younger royals with complicated egos and complicated demands. Woman and home. Inside the palace, there were people who had watched this very carefully and understood exactly what they were seeing. They saw a young woman who could be trusted to do the job without making the job about herself. They saw someone who understood the difference between serving the institution and using the institution. And they saw, clearly and without ambiguity, that she was the kind of person the monarchy needed desperately at this particular moment in its history. Royal commentator Jenny Bond had noted the concern about the monarchy's capacity, saying that the working royals were going to become extremely thin on the ground for the next 15 years or so, depending on when Prince George decided to take up full-time royal duties. That assessment made Louise's potential even more valuable. She wasn't just filling a gap now. She was potentially filling a gap that would exist for the next decade and a half. She was a bridge between the current generation of royals and the next one. And bridges in institutions that run on continuity and stability are not small things. The news. But Camilla's concern was not simply about institutional mechanics. It was deeper than that and more personal. It was about legacy. It was about what her time as queen would be remembered for. She had worked enormously hard to build something meaningful from a position that had once seemed untenable. She had taken on patronages, championed causes, stood beside Charles through his cancer diagnosis with visible warmth and steady courage. She had been, by any reasonable measure, a good queen. She didn't want that to be overshadowed. She didn't want the story of her time as queen to become, in the end, a story about being outmaneuvered, about being eased out, elegantly and without confrontation, by a coalition of people who had a different idea about what the future should look like. The tension inside the palace had reached a point where even people on the periphery of the family's inner circle could feel it, not because anything had been said openly. The Windsors never said things openly, but because the silences had become more loaded, because the careful diplomatic language had become slightly more careful, slightly more diplomatic, in ways that told experienced observers everything they needed to know. What was happening was not a war. It was something more subtle and in some ways more dangerous than a war. It was a question about the future being answered before most people even knew the question was being asked. And the woman who stood at the center of that question, the young woman in the high-vis vest, the one with the degree and the carriage and the quiet manner that somehow managed to make everyone who met her trust her immediately, had no idea how high the stakes around her had become. She was simply doing what she always did, showing up, working hard, saying the right things not because she had been coached to say them, but because they were genuinely what she believed, being in every sense of the word exactly who she appeared to be. And that, paradoxically, was precisely what made her so threatening to the people who had spent their entire lives learning to be something different from what they appeared to be. The confrontation, when it came, would not happen in a throne room. It would not happen in a televised speech or a formal announcement. It would happen the way things always happened inside the House of Windsor. In private, behind closed doors, with enormous emotional weight and very few actual words. The graduation photograph told a story that the palace press team probably hadn't fully intended to tell. King Charles's official team released photographs of Lady Louise Windsor completing her university degree at St. Andrews, with the king's statement offering personal congratulations and noting that Louise had been joined by her proud parents, the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh, as they celebrated the end of her degree. The king weighed in personally. He didn't have to do that. There are dozens of royal birthdays and graduations every year that pass without the king's direct, warm, public acknowledgement. The fact that he chose to make his feelings known in that particular way, at that particular moment, was the kind of signal that people inside royal circles understood immediately. Geo News. Louise had graduated, but more than that, she had arrived. Lady Louise Windsor was stepping into a more visible role, offering quiet but steady support to Prince William and Princess Kate, and she was being seen as a new royal ally for the Wales family at a moment of significant internal tension within the firm. That framing, ally, was significant. It placed Louise inside a narrative that was bigger than her own story. It connected her rise to the broader conversation about what the monarchy would look like in the William and Kate era, about who would be trusted and who would be kept at arm's length, about how the institution would navigate the gap between the generation currently in charge and the generation waiting to take over. MSN. Camilla understood all of this. She had been inside this institution long enough to read its subtext fluently. And the subtext of what was happening around Lady Louise was not subtle, regardless of how carefully everyone involved chose their words in public. The message being sent, through the photograph and the congratulations and the quiet but unmistakable championing of this young woman by the most powerful people in the family, was that the future had a face. And that face belonged to Louise. The frustration that built inside Camilla was not the kind of frustration that expresses itself through shouting or confrontation. She was far too experienced, far too disciplined for that. It was a colder, quieter frustration, the kind that settles into the bones. The kind that a person carries into a room and masks so perfectly that only the people who know her best can detect it in the slight tension around her eyes, in the particular stillness that comes over her when a subject arises that she has decided not to engage with directly. Those close to Camilla described her reaction to the news of Louise's elevation in terms that were careful but revealing. She was not simply unhappy about Louise personally. Louise, as a person, was difficult to object to. Everyone agreed on that. She was polite, hardworking, discreet, and genuinely likable. The objection was not to Louise. The objection was to the way the decision had been made, to the way she felt she had been informed rather than consulted, to the growing sense that decisions about the shape of the royal family were being made in spaces where her voice was not fully present. Sources described Camilla as becoming territorial when William and Kate appeared to be expanding their circle of influence, viewing the growing relationship between the Wales family and Lady Louise as evidence that the future king and his wife were drawing up plans that did not fully account for her position or the king's. Yahoo! That concern about being excluded from the planning was at the heart of everything, because Camilla was not simply the queen in a ceremonial sense. She was Charles's closest confidant. She was the person he turned to when he needed to think through the most difficult decisions. She was part of every major conversation about the institution's direction, or at least she had believed she was. The question now was whether that was still true, whether the conversations happening between Charles and William about Louise and about the future were conversations she was fully part of, or conversations that were reaching her, fully formed, as conclusions she was expected to simply accept. The power dynamic inside the palace was shifting, not dramatically, not in ways that would generate screaming headlines or official statements, but shifting nonetheless. Astrologer Debbie Frank had predicted that 2026 would see Camilla stepping back from duties that younger royals could perform, noting that her role would be clearly defined from April onwards, with a firm strategy in place. The prediction was accurate, but the experience of living that shift from the inside was more complicated than any prediction could capture. There is a difference between choosing to step back and feeling that the ground is being gently rearranged beneath your feet, while everyone around you maintains that everything is perfectly normal. AOL. Louise, for her part, had moved through this period with the same uncomplicated integrity that had marked everything she did. She had not sought the attention. She had not lobbied for a bigger role. She had simply graduated from university, accepted the warm public acknowledgement of her king and her family, and continued doing the things she had always done. She worked at the horse show. She attended family events. She carried herself with a simplicity and warmth that continued to disarm people who expected royal behavior to come with a certain amount of performance attached. She was also known to have developed a particularly close bond with Princess Charlotte, the king and queen's granddaughter by marriage through William, and sweet moments between the two had been captured at public events over the years, showcasing a warm, genuine connection between cousins. This mattered because it showed that Louise's place in the family was not manufactured. It was organic. It had grown from years of showing up and being real with people who were surrounded, every day of their lives, by people trying to manage impressions and perform relationships rather than simply having them. Hello. A royal expert made the point that Lady Louise's lack of a major royal title could actually strengthen the trust William had in her, because it allowed her to operate with less public pressure and fewer expectations, while still maintaining close family ties. The expert noted that a future King William was expected to continue pushing a slimmed-down monarchy, which meant he would prefer trusted relatives who could support key causes and appearances without becoming permanent full-time working royals. And Louise's position gave her exactly that kind of flexibility, allowing her to step in when needed without attracting the same level of scrutiny that came with senior titles. Internewscast Journal. This was the brilliance of it, and it was a brilliance that Louise herself had never consciously engineered. By not having a princess title, by not being a working royal in the formal sense, she existed in a space that was almost uniquely useful. She could be present without being a target. She could contribute without becoming a lightning rod. She could support the institution and the people she loved within it without the full weight of institutional expectation crushing the very qualities, the spontaneity, the authenticity, the genuine warmth that made her valuable in the first place. For Camilla, the particular sting of this was that it mirrored, in some ways, her own position from years earlier. She too had once navigated the royal family from a position of unofficial but deeply significant influence. She too had operated in spaces where her presence mattered enormously without being formalized in ways that would attract too much scrutiny. She knew, better than almost anyone, how much power could exist in that kind of unofficial proximity to the heart of the institution. And she knew, therefore, exactly how significant Louise's position was becoming, regardless of what it was formally called. The conversation that Charles and Camilla eventually had about all of this was not a conversation that was reported. It was not leaked. It was not the subject of anonymous briefings to newspaper editors or carefully placed stories in the royal press corps. It was private, the way the most important conversations in that family always were. But people close to Camilla said that she was direct with the king, that she voiced her concerns clearly and without drama, that she did not object to Louise. She objected to feeling as though a blueprint for the future was being drawn up around her rather than with her. Charles, by all accounts, listened. He took her concerns seriously. He did not dismiss them or manage them or redirect them with the kind of diplomatic evasion that royal conversations are famous for. He understood what she was telling him, and he understood, too, the particular irony of her position, that the woman who had once been kept outside the circle of royal acceptance was now, from her hard-won place inside it, feeling the first tremors of something that felt uncomfortably similar. The announcement about Louise's role was not rolled back. It was not softened or reframed. Charles did not suddenly develop second thoughts about the young woman he had publicly congratulated and clearly admired. Louise's place within the family continued to grow, continued to solidify, continued to become the kind of settled fact that institutions build their futures on. But something did change in the weeks that followed. The way the change was communicated, internally, shifted. The conversations became more inclusive. Camilla's perspective was more visibly factored in. The planning that had been happening, partly in spaces she didn't fully occupy, began to happen in spaces where her voice was clearly present. It was a small adjustment in the grand scheme of everything the royal family was managing. But it mattered, because it was a reminder for everyone, including Camilla, that the institution's strength had always come from its ability to hold its tensions without breaking. From its ability to be many things at once, to honor continuity while embracing change, to make room for the new without erasing the people who had earned their place the hard way. Some royal commentators argued that the monarchy could no longer afford to overlook younger members of the family, while others maintained that the institution's future depended on remaining accountable and not expanding in ways that the public would find unjustifiable. Both of those things were true simultaneously. That was the impossible tightrope the modern monarchy walked every single day. And it was the tightrope that everyone connected to this story. Charles, Camilla, William, Kate, and the quiet young woman at the center of it all was learning to walk together. Royal Central. Louise herself, when she spoke to people who had the privilege of spending time with her in this period, seemed genuinely unaware of the scale of the political currents swirling around her. She talked about her degree. She talked about her plans. She talked about carriage driving and the horse show and what she might want to do next with her life. She was 22 years old, she had just graduated from one of the most celebrated universities in Britain, and she had a family that loved her and a future that, for the first time, felt genuinely full of possibility. She was not thinking about palace politics. She was thinking about what came next. What came next, as it turned out, was exactly what everyone had hoped and precisely what nobody had fully planned. It was the beginning of something, a new chapter in a very old story, A moment when the British monarchy, battered by years of drama and scandal and grief and reinvention, found in this quiet, capable, carriage-driving English student something it had been looking for without quite knowing it was looking. Stability, authenticity, a connection to the past that did not look backwards but carried the past forward gently in capable hands. Camilla's fury, as the world had started calling it, that sharp, contained frustration at being outpaced by events she hadn't fully controlled, did not disappear overnight. She was too human for that, too honest with herself to pretend that the feelings simply resolved themselves because the institution required it of her. But fury in the House of Windsor has a way of becoming something else over time. It becomes watchfulness. It becomes wisdom. It becomes, eventually, the kind of hard-earned knowledge that can only come from having survived everything the institution has thrown at you and still being standing. As one headline noted, Queen Camilla had been through the experience of swallowing a bitter pill where King Charles's decisions were concerned before, and she had survived it and grown from it, and come out the other side with her position intact and her reputation, against all odds, enhanced. This would be no different. It would just take time. Geo News. And meanwhile, Lady Louise Windsor, the girl nobody had been watching, the quiet one, the one in the high-vis vest with the university degree and the carriage whip and the steady eyes, continued to show up, continued to work, continued to be in every way that mattered exactly who she had always been. The monarchy would change around her. Camilla would adjust. Charles would navigate. William and Kate would plan, but Louise would simply be Louise. And in a family where being simply yourself was the rarest and most difficult thing in the world to manage, that was the most powerful thing of all.